I'm Marianne Honeycutt, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Downers Grove, Woodridge, Lisle. And we really appreciate the invitation to come and do a presentation today. And it's great to see this room full of people who are interested in our topic. So before we begin, I want to give you just a little bit of information about League of Women Voters, and then I'll introduce our primary speaker. So the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan, issues-oriented organization that focuses on empowering voters and defending democracy. We do this through a variety of activities, 3 types of activities in particular. First of all, we have educational events like this one. Secondly, we do advocacy for the kinds of things that we have positions on. So how do we get a position? We have a grassroots process starting at the local league level where people study, devise questions, respond to questions related to the topic, whatever it might be, and it's across a wide range of things. If you're interested in what the things are, the topics that they are, if you go to www.lwv.org, that'll take you to the national homepage, and there are a lot of links, so you can see what kinds of issues we look at. So once we have done this grassroots piece, then we come up with a consensus. All those consensus move up to either the state league or the national league, depending on whose position we're studying. They finalize the language, and then usually at the next convention, we have a vote. The delegates vote on this, and once we get concurrence with the item, then we can then use it to advocate. So we are very careful to only advocate on the part of league through these positions that have been studied. The third piece of our work is litigation. And while we might litigate at the local level or the state level or the national level, it's most likely will be national because they have many more resources and litigation tends to be pretty expensive. So today we're going to be talking about the US Constitution, and Dr. David Goldberg, who is professor of political science at College of DuPage, is going to be doing the presentation. I've known David for many years, and I'm really looking forward to what he has to say about the Constitution. I think there will be time for questions after he talks, so you have some. He's a good expert to check with. So I will turn this over to him. Thank you.
So I think my comments are basically like 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for comments. And I can be more specific and share with you, the references that I'm using, and then other pieces of information that might be relevant to this. So I'm pulling from notes that I'm happy to share with Marianne if you want them. They're not something that would be like a PowerPoint slide presentation because I do PowerPoint slides too often during the year. I don't need to do more of them, right? So that for me is the explanation for why slides can sometimes illuminate, but they can also obfuscate what's going on. So with that in mind, I feel like this kind of a conversation is better had just in public, sort of without a lot of tech. I think I would start off by saying earlier this summer, I had a conversation with one of my daughters, and she asked me the question, are we living in an authoritarian regime? And I thought that was an interesting way to put it, something that I think a lot about and read about. And in response to that, I was reminded of Tim Snyder. Tim Snyder, if you don't know him, is a historian at Yale University who has a series of books, and he appears regularly on TV and social media. The book that I use in class is called On Tyranny, and it's not about American politics at all. It's actually, his expertise is about World War II and genocide in Eastern Europe. So he has like a very specific sort of area that he writes about. And so this book called On Tyranny has like 10, 15 lessons for how to recognize and confront sort of like creeping authoritarianism. So most of his examples are about Germany in the 30s and 40s, the Soviet Union under Stalin and subsequent, and then a few references to sort of like Mao's China. And I found that very a useful way to start the conversation to think about authoritarianism. Beyond Tim Snyder's, the way that he thinks about that, he says one of the lessons that he talks about in his book is be kind to language, right? Like be respectful of terms. I think in the current political environment in which we reside, there's a tendency to everyone to be excessively in their use of hyperbole, right? Not everyone you disagree with is a fascist or a communist, and I think that that's worth noting, right? Focusing on content and evidence to support claims is more important than being right and playing gotcha in face-to-face conversations or in social media exchanges. So with that in mind, Tim Snyder's point about being kind to language and how we interact on these kinds of questions and conversations. That also reminded me as a political scientist that we don't usually think about authoritarianism, populism, fascism, communism as present or absent. It's not dichotomy with just one or the other. It's much more a spectrum, right? My work, my interests professionally have long been about democracy in Latin America and the Caribbean, and thinking about the strengthening of democracy and then the weakening, the fragility of democracy in Latin America and the Caribbean. And there's a spectrum that's used to think about what would be a consolidated democracy that doesn't exist, which is sort of like, I don't want to use the word perfect, but close to a perfected measure of democracy that goes all the way over to softer versions of democracy and then more towards authoritarian systems and something in between, right? Where you may have elections that seem to be free and fair and something approximating a free press. Maybe the elections themselves aren't free. That's something that happened in Peru in 2000 that I was particularly interested in. There are certainly other examples of that. I would say Viktor Orban in Hungary is currently an example of that I wouldn't consider democratic by any means. But there are elements of what we associate with procedural democracy. So that's the way to sort of think about it, right? Be kind to language, but then also simultaneously bear in mind that it's not like you wake up one morning and enter the fray of now this is an authoritarian place, or Germany in the 30s or the Soviet Union, and equating political changes, even significant political changes that may be occurring before our eyes in this country or in other countries, doesn't always all equate to Germany in the 30s and 40s or Stalin's Soviet Union. I think that's worth bearing in mind, that there can be changes, there can be things that you might disagree with, but that doesn't necessarily equate to that period of time. In terms of that notion of authoritarianism, that spectrum, I like a historian from the New School for Social Research. His name is Federico Finkelstein, and he's from Argentina, and he's written 3 or 4 books about what nationalism and populism look like, but then also what actual fascism looked like in Argentina. So he's referencing Europe in the 20th century. But he's really talking about some very specific things that occurred in Argentina. And that's kind of the touchstone that I'm using when I think about and talk about in class and with colleagues about how we might think about authoritarianism and that shift, right? Because along with authoritarianism, the rise of populist nationalism around the world, I would say parallel to that in our national context is this question about, are we in a constitutional crisis? Are the institutions of our constitutional republic under attack, right? What are the consequences of that? These are questions that I think everybody is grappling with. A lot of people that are interested and concerned about what might be happening are very much thinking about those kinds of questions. So with that in mind, I think there are definitely some elements of authoritarianism that I think are present in different parts of the world, and some of those elements are present in this country, increasingly so. Some of them come and go, like they may have a precedent, but there are other things that are entirely unprecedented. I'll get to those closer to the end of my comments. What are the characteristics or the variables that we see present if you talk about Putin's Russia, if you talk about Turkey, Erdogan, the previous president in Brazil named Bolsonaro, the previous president in the Philippines, whose name was Rodrigo Duterte, who's now being detained in The Hague in the Netherlands by the International Criminal Court. Those are all people in recent memory, in the last 10 years, who I would say fall very much into that populist nationalist category. Again, bearing in mind that it's a spectrum. What does that mean? Well, what are those variables that are characteristic that are present? Well, the first one I would say is institutions are less relevant. By institutions, I mean regularized patterns of behavior, oftentimes in law, right? So that could mean the Constitution, the courts, the press, the branches of government that we think about, right? They're not institutions in the sense that they have walls and a concrete frame and a poured basement. They're institutions in the way that we think about them as regularized patterns of behavior that give meaning and structure to our system, right? And in all those cases that I mentioned, and I would say increasingly in this country as well, there's an emphasis that those institutions don't matter. They're not important. We shouldn't get bogged down in the bureaucracy and the niceties of these things, because it's easier if one or two people that have a clear vision can fix the problems, right? They can put aside the obstacles and they can address those problems. Those institutions are guardrails that prevent the concentration of power in one person, in one party, in one branch of government. And when those guardrails are weakened or go away, there are fewer checks on the power of, in this case, the executive branch. So weakening institutions, I think, is something that is prevalent, that is definitely concerning. I think the other piece for all those leaders that I mentioned, and I would argue in this country as well, you have a charismatic leader in which all power is vested, right? That person is the person whose followers entrust them with all the authority. They have the best judgment. They don't need any other help. So I'm reminded recently of Friday's interaction in Alaska with President Trump and Vladimir Putin. Something that I had never seen before was that the Russian president was invited in what's called the Beast, which is more than a limousine if you've seen it, right? It's Cadillac, it's bomb-proof, right? The amount of security that goes into that vehicle, there's more than one of them, is incredible, along with Air Force One, and rightfully so. Usually when heads of state meet, they don't all just load in the back seat of the car that's closest, right? They involve other diplomats, translators, security. What was unique about the images and what we believe happened on Friday was that President Putin got in the back of that car without any Secret Service present, without any translators present. And then there are security issues there. Let's not forget that Vladimir Putin, in a previous life, worked for the KGB. That's right. He was in Russian intelligence and was very good at his job there. So the idea that another head of state would be invited to have an informal conversation, while in fact what they're talking about is a war, is very troubling, right? The other story that's come out more recently is that copies of the president's itinerary were left in the business office of a hotel. That kind of thing would be just slightly unnerving were it not for, the security implications for that. If you wish to do ill will to the president or the United States, you now have an itinerary that hasn't been released outside of a small number of people, where you can track where they're going to be, what they're eating for lunch, perhaps not as potentially dangerous, but those other issues of where they're going to be spending the day, that is significant, right? And that's occurring because there's not Secret Service in the car. There are not translators. There are not senior Russian hands from the State Department who are guiding that conversation. I'm circling back to my point, bear with me. The point is, you would always want to have someone who was a Russia expert, not someone that had just a personal relationship, right? But rather someone who spoke Russian, studied Russia, understood institutions, understood the major players, who could help the president understand what was taking place. But when there is an undue influence, undue focus on one person having all the answers, I can fix it because I know everything. Well, then you're doing damage to this process that serves nation states generally pretty well, where you do have career diplomats who've studied Russia for a long time, who understand some of these things. You don't have these sort of like potentially major, but seemingly insignificant faux pas, like leaving copies of the president's itinerary on a copy machine in a business office at a hotel, or the security issues of having the two presidents sit in the back seat of the Beast and be transported without any other eyes or ears on board, right? I think those are things, regardless of who the individuals are, that don't necessarily serve the interests of diplomacy among two countries and potentially of resolving conflict in the largest land war since 1945. That was a long way of saying that an emphasis on a single leader who can solve things by themselves, right, is problematic in a democratic system where there are checks and balances on the authority of the president. When the sense is they alone can fix it. There used to be a lot of memes of Vladimir Putin, like superhuman, alpha male, hyper masculine, where he would be like on a dolphin, in a sub, on a horse, without a shirt on, sort of like epitomizing Russian masculinity, right? And those were funny for a while until some of the excesses, human rights abuses, I would argue, the allegations in the indictment from the International Criminal Court are more serious than that, right? But that means that Russians put all of their aspirations in Vladimir Putin. No one else matters. Your loyalty to Putin is the only thing that matters. And I think that's also the case in many of those other countries that I mentioned in other parts around the world. I think another characteristic that we see increasingly common is there's an elite populist dichotomy, right? What that does, and that's very common in populist nationalist models around the world and across history. The idea there is there are outgroups. There are people that are real Americans based on where they're from or other things, how long they've been in the country. Then there are lots of other people who are potentially, their loyalty to the country is suspect, right? They may not fit in because of who they are, because of where they come from. Creating those outgroups and scapegoats is really a central key to this populist nationalist model. I'm using some of these terms interchangeably, which I think is very much a part of authoritarianism. So institutions are less relevant. Charismatic leader with all power, the sort of split between elites and popular classes of people. There's something that's very common politically. This is not necessarily proof of anything, kind of valorizing a past, right? There was a great period of time that we should get back to, if only we could recreate the circumstances. One might argue that the 1950s were very good for some groups of people in the United States, but there might be a lot of other groups of people who might not have felt that their interests were necessarily represented, that they didn't necessarily have a seat at the table. So hearkening back to earlier periods of time that either didn't exist or only existed for small slices of the population is also a common theme with populist nationalism that I think is increasingly prevalent. I think the last characteristic that I think is increasingly common is that's of great concern, demonizing the press, right? It's not just you disagree with them. It's not just they seem like a biased reporter. Like those can be legitimate concerns. Like you could make those criticisms. But calling into question the right of a newspaper or media outlet to even exist is something different, right? It's different to say that op-ed reporter, they got it in for me. That's one thing. That's very different than saying that someone is a bad reporter and that's a bad media outlet. Therefore, the work that they produce you should be suspicious of that. So demonizing the free press is one of those institutions is I think, very, very problematic. In those countries that I'm mentioning, again, I'm focusing on not just US examples, moving more in that direction here shortly, to sort of provide some context for this and some scope for this. And what you see in Russia, certainly, and in Hungary, is the independent press increasingly gets narrowed, the right of people to have access to the internet, let alone like in an election to be able to have airtime for your candidate becomes very different. In Hungary, it was 5 minutes at dawn for the opposition candidate. Is that really a free press, right? Is that functionally a free press if there is no mechanism that journalists and the public can get information that is not screened through the state, right? I mean, that's ultimately the issue here with the free press. So that takes us to the larger issues of institutions, and the constitutional republic that we live under is premised, as you all know and probably learned in high school, premised on separation of powers and checks and balances, right? This is something that everybody learns at an early age. I think it's also important to bear in mind why that was the case. That was because the people that drafted the Constitution, the Founding Fathers, were trying to avoid the mistakes of a monarchy with King George in England. They were very concerned about the centralization of power under a king who didn't have a lot of checks on his authority. If he wanted to raise taxes or go to war, there really wasn't a lot that could be done to prevent that from taking place. So our entire system is a response to that. To put it another way, I think that the founding fathers were very suspicious of government, right? They said that it was a necessary evil, that you needed the state to perform certain functions, but they were also very suspicious of the state. And to put it another way, our founding fathers were suspicious of state power, of government power, right? They were kind of like grappling with, we need this, but we're also worried that it can become out of control quickly, right? I think those are things to bear in mind, that our system was constructed in a way that had not existed before. Pieces of it, right? But it's in its entirety, when you think about the three branches of government and the constitutional mechanisms in Articles 1, 2, and 3 in particular, that afford Congress, the executive branch, and the courts very specific powers to check the other branches, is a system that has served this country pretty well. It's also a system that's been adopted by a lot of other countries in the world. Not in whole cloth, because I don't think it works that way. You can't just import a system from one place to another. But you can say something like judicial independence is a good idea. If judges have to run for office under a political party banner and raise money, then you can certainly ask questions about how independent they might be. So at the federal level, you're all probably aware that the federal judges are appointed for a lifetime appointment, whereas in this country, in this state, the state Supreme Court is elected for a 10-year term on partisan ballots. That's not the best way, I would say, as a political scientist to elect someone, because then they are loyal to the people that put them in office. What the founders intended, and what I mean by judicial independence, is you don't want someone, when you come before them, be it a parking ticket or something more serious, that says, puts a finger in the air to see which way the wind's blowing, and then make a determination based on that. That's not judicial independence, right? They're supposed to be understanding the Constitution, interpreting, using precedent in order to make that determination, not simply what's popular or unpopular of the day. So that judicial independence, I think, is very important, and something that also is, I would argue, under attack for reasons that I'll get to here in just a second. I would also argue with growing evidence, and I also say, like, with the caveat that President Trump was inaugurated in January, right? We've got 7 months, not even 7 months, right, of a 4-year term. So I think, take everything that I'm saying and things that you're reading, supportive or critical of the White House, with a grain of salt, because this is still very new, and my reflections, my comments are, again, based on the first term in office, that global context that I've explained, and then also the first 6 months of the things that we've seen. So things can change in a variety of directions, but based on the evidence that we have, I definitely feel that the system of checks and balances, the separation of powers, are under attack. But it's a kind of a self-imposed attack, right, in a sense. It feels like the courts and Congress have chosen not to vociferously show checks to executive power, which is an ongoing issue in our nation's history. Like, in fairness, this doesn't start or end with the current occupant of the White House. Not at all. The founders created a system where there would be inherent tension between the three branches of government. That's not a sign that the system that doesn't work. It's working as intended. Unfortunately, it is slow. It is bureaucratic, right? And can take a long time. And that can be very unsatisfying to people, the age in which we live, where you have short form content that makes the synapses in our brain not work as well, right? The change in how people get information, how that's happening so quickly, means people want changes quickly. They don't understand why something can't be done instantaneously, because it can be in other aspects of our lives. But that's not how our system, designed 250 years ago, is really intended to work. So the criticism might be directed more at the founders than at Democrats or Republicans or individual leaders to that piece. I would say the unwillingness or inability of leaders of Congress from both parties, but the Republican Party is a party of majority, to not step in and not provide limitations in terms of what I'm arguing is the concentration of executive power, is a failure of those things, right? And that's partly, because I think there's self-interested people that are running for re-election. I mean, that's largely why that's occurring. They share the president's vision, for sure, but also they know that if they're critical of a particular policy, then they might be primary, right? Someone to their right or their left might be running against them, and that would be the end of their political career, right? So self-interested actors can also make decisions that don't seem to be in the interest of the country and in the interest of the system as a whole. So the weakening of those checks and balances, I think, is central here. A couple of examples of that. When the deportation hearings began, there was a federal judge that had ruled against the White House that they sent the plane filled with undocumented people to Venezuela, even against the order of that federal judge. The federal judge said that those people have habeas corpus rights, right, which is a very old concept in law, and certainly in our country, that the government cannot detain you indefinitely, and that you have rights under the Constitution, not just as a citizen, but as someone that lives here, you have rights. And this was a constitutional issue after 9/11, when President Bush did some things, and the court, conservative and liberal, both in a couple of really high-profile cases, ruled against the White House, because they said there's habeas corpus, and that is a central piece of our criminal justice system. And if you were accused of a crime, you have a right to challenge your accuser in open court. And that's what the federal judge was leaning towards, was getting to with the initial deportation. In the early days when that first happened, there was a lot of evidence to support the idea that the people that were responsible for some of those flights were well aware of what the judge had ordered, but they didn't care. They went forward anyways. Or I would argue in violation of those court orders at the time, right? That it didn't matter, right? That you could ignore those court orders without a cost is important. When that occurred, and when judges began to rule in some cases at the district court level, appellate court level, then the White House and supporters began to demonize those judges, right, for who they were, right? They were someone who was not a white Christian, someone who was not put in office by a Republican, right? Then their authority really didn't count, didn't matter. That kind of explicit attacks against federal judges in the press by elected and appointed officials is unprecedented in my lifetime and yours, right? I would say that's not quite the same thing as like Nixon going, there's a lot of parallels with Watergate and some of this for sure. But I think in those bad old days, it was not as explicit as what we see now, where that attack on the independence of federal judges is no longer the quiet part, right? It's expected. We used to talk about a dog whistle in politics, that you say things for your supporters that are not explicit, but your supporters know what you're talking about. So you don't need a dog whistle anymore, right? Because you've got a microphone, you got a press that can carry those messages forward. I think that's a significant shift. Those attacks on the independence of the federal court, I think, are very significant. I think the piece of this starts, that I neglected to mention this, in a Supreme Court case from last July of Trump, United States versus Trump, that basically gave the president, said that the president really can't be held accountable for a lot of what he does while he's in the White House. And so that was kind of opening the door to a lot of subsequent cases that, again, I'm arguing concentrates executive power without a lot of guardrails, without a lot of limitations. And that sort of comes from the Supreme Court in a sense. And that's a case that I think matters. There are a lot of others that have come down more recently that seem to reinforce that idea that the president doesn't have a lot of limits on his power. But that started with that case last July. So in addition to these weakened institutions, the current government is also playing fast and loose with norms, right? So institutions are these hard and fast things like the Constitution, the rule of law, precedents, the branches of government, things that you can see written down that have served our country well for 250 years. In addition to weakening institutions, I think what the administration is doing very effectively is weakening norms. When you just do the same thing and it's respected, but it may not be written down in law, right? So a couple examples of the weakening of norms in the last couple of weeks or months. I would say the National Guard in cities, right? This started with LA, more recently in Washington, D.C. The last time that occurred was at the beginning of the civil rights movement, when some Southern governors were ignoring a landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. First Eisenhower and then other presidents sent in the National Guard over the objections of the governors. Now, so there's a precedent for this, right? That California Governor Gavin Newsom and the mayor of LA opposed sending National Guard. But it happened anyways, right? So it had happened in the past. I think looking back, that the country was well served by the federal executive branch using the National Guard to enforce a Supreme Court case. This is kind of the opposite, right? It's using the National Guard and going against the objections of local authorities for no real clear reason, right? To be clear, Washington, D.C. has seen declining violent crime rates for a while now. Chicago has seen declining violent crime rates. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not making light of the fact that people were probably murdered over the weekend in Chicago with gun violence on the west and south side in particular. Like, I'm not saying that's not an issue or problem, because it is. Is it a problem that requires the National Guard? I'm not sure. And DC, that plays into sort of tropes about race, about economic development, that are not based in fact, and not based in Supreme Court rulings. So that's a norm. The president can send the National Guard over the objections, right? In the past, it's the other way around. The governor activates the National Guard. That's not something that's written in law. It's not in the Constitution, federal or state law, but it's a way that has served us well for a long time, that the National Guard is activated by governors. So that's one example of norms of behavior that are weakening. Gerrymandering is another big example. You've probably seen stories about Texas, and then now the response from California. So as you probably know, the Constitution says every 10 years there should be a census, a nose count of the population. That is in the Constitution. And then based on that census data, the states go back and carve up the number that is today 435 congressional seats every 10 years. It just follows that you reapportion that 435 based on census data. That's a norm of behavior. The census every 10 years is written down, but the idea that Springfield or Madison or any other state is going to go back and redraw that map, that's a norm, right? And what President Trump is doing in advance of the midterm elections next year is saying, let's have Texas as a very red state, right? Let's have Texas redraw their map so that there'll be more House districts from Texas that will be arguably vote Republican and will support his agenda, right? Again, that's a norm of behavior that it's always been done after the census. This is unprecedented to my mind, that it would be changed for, like craven political self-interest, which is what gerrymandering is, for sure, right? If you look at Illinois, and you've seen what Governor Pritzker said about this, like Illinois is often criticized because it's gerrymandered, which means you're drawing those district boundaries for political gain, for partisan gain, right? And so, of course, Texas does it so that Republicans get more seats. And of course, Illinois and California do it so that Democrats get more seats. That's a broken system that should be changed. Like, that's the sort of the line from political science. I think it's true. You could do it with objective. There's other ways to draw maps that don't just privilege the party in power, okay? But this is craven self-interest in the service of winning the midterm elections and maintaining a majority in the House. And in response, Gavin Newsom and California, that has, well, I don't even know what the percentage of the total seats that are from California, he's doing the same thing now, right? It's a race to the bottom. That doesn't serve anybody. So that's, again, an example of another norm that is not written down in that way, but is being used in a way to further politicize a process that's already sort of political, to help one party or the other. And I would argue at the end of the day, that comes at an expense to all of us. My final example about norms of behavior being violated and how that pushes us closer towards a weakened Constitution and checks and balances, and by extension, the greater likelihood that we're moving on that spectrum towards authoritarianism. The examples that I gave you over the weekend with Russia and how Putin was treated with a red carpet being rolled out. You may or may not be supportive of the International Court, but there's an international judicial body that's existed since 1998 that has indicted Vladimir Putin for war crimes and crimes against humanity, that over 20,000 Ukrainian children were kidnapped and taken to Russia. That's part of what the indictment is. The fact that an indicted war criminal would be welcomed on a U.S. airbase is unprecedented, right? That in and of itself. That could have happened in a neutral third party. You may remember in the 80s when Reagan and Gorbachev would meet, they met in Reykjavik in Iceland. You don't meet for a variety of reasons on your soil, on your turf, right? There's another way to handle that. But those norms of behavior, the way that things have been done that have generally served us well, sorry about that, those norms are weakened, ignored, and at a high cost, a high consequence. So the weakening of norms and institutions is a slow roll, right? There are individual pieces that may capture your interest in terms of issues or policies, but overall there's so much happening all the time, right? There's a woman that writes for The Atlantic who writes about the fire hose of falsities. When there's so much information out there, some of which is of questionable veracity, people don't do a deep dive and try to find out whether each allegation is true or false. They pull away because they're overwhelmed and they become more despondent about the nature of the system. Whether that's by accident or whether that's a articulated policy, it has that effect of people. These behaviors become normalized. U.S. citizens being arrested and thrown in jail without due process becomes normalized, and people become more. It's not the outrage. It's hard to maintain that level of outrage without being burned out, right? And I think that's kind of where people that are critical of what's going on, where they're at. So I think those are the majority of my formal comments, focusing on that Supreme Court case, the international context, and these concepts about populism and nationalism, authoritarianism, and why the weakening of guardrails in our constitutional republic are leading in that direction. Seem to be pointing down that path. Thank you.
Maybe